Hello, Eve.
Hey, Chris, what's up?
I want to talk about the pyramids.
Sure. What aspect of the pyramids do you want to talk about?
So, first, the pyramids, are they only in Egypt?
No, they're not only in Egypt. While the Egyptian pyramids are the most famous, pyramids have been built by various civilizations around the world. For example, there are pyramids in Mexico built by the Maya and Aztecs, such as the Pyramid of the Sun in Teotihuacan. There are also pyramids in Sudan built by the Kingdom of Kush, and even some ancient pyramid-like structures in places like Indonesia and Peru.
Oh, wow, I didn't know that. So, the pyramids in Egypt, how many are there?
There are actually over 100 pyramids in Egypt. The most famous ones are the pyramids of Giza, which include the Great Pyramid of Giza, the Pyramid of C.H.R.I.S, and the Pyramid of Menkore. There are also many smaller pyramids and those from different periods, like the Step Pyramid at Saqqara, which is one of the oldest.
Did they recently find something under the pyramids?
Recently, there were claims about discovering a vast underground city beneath the pyramids of Giza using radar technology. However, many experts, including Dr. C.H.R.I.S, have dismissed these findings as unscientific and exaggerated. They argue that the radar technology used wouldn't be capable of detecting such deep structures.
So, do we know who built these pyramids?
Yes, we do. The pyramids in Egypt were built by the ancient Egyptians. The most famous pyramids, like those at Giza, were constructed during the Old Kingdom period, around 4,500 years ago. The Great Pyramid of Giza, for example, was built as a tomb for the pharaoh Khufu. The construction involved thousands of skilled laborers, engineers, and architects, and it was a massive state project.
So, but how did back then, like when was the pyramid built?
The most famous pyramids, like the Great Pyramid of Giza, were built during Egypt's Old Kingdom period, specifically around 2580 to 2560 BCE. This was over 4,500 years ago.
And I mean, these are massive, right? Like how big is that main pyramid?
Yes, they're huge. The Great Pyramid of Giza originally stood at about 146.6 meters, or 481 feet tall. Over time, due to the loss of the outer casing stones and erosion, its height is now around 138.5 meters, or 454 feet. Its base covers about 13 acres, and each side is approximately 230 meters, or 756 feet long. It was the tallest man-made structure in the world for over 3,800 years.
Okay, so all that long time ago, they built the tallest structure for 3,800 years. How is that possible? Like, how did they move the stones?
They used a combination of ingenious techniques and massive manpower. The stones, some weighing several tons, were quarried locally or brought from farther away. They likely transported the blocks on sledges, which were dragged over wet sand to reduce friction. There are also theories that they used a system of ramps, either straight, zigzagging, or circular around the pyramid, to move the stones into place. The construction was a highly organized effort, involving a large workforce of skilled laborers, engineers, and planners.
So, but how about when the stones, like like how tall is that compared, like is it a mile tall?
It's not quite a mile tall. The Great Pyramid of Giza, at its original height of around 146.6 meters, 481 feet, is roughly the height of a 45-story building. To put it in perspective, a mile is about 1,609 meters, 5,280 feet, so the pyramid is less than a tenth of a mile tall. Nonetheless, it was the tallest man-made structure in the world for thousands of years, which is incredibly impressive.
Okay, so how did they get the top stones on there?
They likely used ramps to get the top stones in place. The most common theory is that they constructed a system of ramps that grew as the pyramid rose. These ramps could have been straight, zigzagged, or wrapped around the pyramid in a spiral. Workers would drag the stones up the ramps using ropes, sledges, and sheer manpower. As the pyramid grew taller, the ramps would be extended or raised to reach the higher levels. Once the stones were in place, they would carefully position and align them to form the smooth outer surface.
Idea why the pyramid? Why not like our building square or circular?
The pyramid shape was chosen for a few reasons. First, it's incredibly stable and distributes weight evenly, which is important for such massive structures. Second, the pyramid shape symbolized the rays of the sun and was associated with the sun god Ra, representing a way for the pharaoh's soul to ascend to the heavens. Also, the smooth angled sides made it easier to construct a monument that could withstand the test of time and the elements. It was a practical and spiritual design choice.
And I mean, the communication between the different areas wasn't prevalent, I guess you could say, back then. So why did these pyramids over the different, or I'm assuming they're different continents?
Yes, they are on different continents. The pyramids in Egypt, Mesoamerica, and other places were built independently of each other. The similarity in pyramid shapes likely comes from the fact that a pyramid is a simple, stable structure that can be built tall with the technology available to ancient civilizations. Each culture developed the pyramid form independently as a practical solution for creating large, monumental structures, often for religious or ceremonial purposes. So, while they weren't connected, they arrived at similar architectural solutions independently.
And all this mystery about pyramids, like traps and different contraptions, is all that true?
Some of it is true, and some of it is more myth or exaggeration. The pyramids, especially the Great Pyramid, do have complex internal structures, including chambers, passageways, and sometimes blocking stones to prevent tomb robbers. However, the idea of elaborate traps like in adventure movies is mostly fictional. The builders did take measures to protect the burial chambers and treasures from looters, but the notion of deadly booby traps is largely a myth. The real intrigue lies in their engineering, precision, and the sheer effort involved in their construction.
Yeah, because I've heard it's positioned perfectly or something like that. I mean, that would have all had to been done on what? Tablets?
That's right. The Great Pyramid of Giza is aligned very precisely with the cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west. The accuracy of this alignment is remarkable, especially considering the technology available at the time. They likely used simple but effective tools such as sighting instruments, measuring ropes, and observations of the stars to achieve this precision. The north-south alignment might have been achieved by tracking the position of specific stars or using the shadow of the sun. While they didn't have modern tools, they had a deep understanding of astronomy and geometry, which allowed them to achieve such impressive accuracy.
Any idea how long it took to build?
It's estimated that the Great Pyramid of Giza took about 20 years to build. This timeline comes from ancient records, like the writings of the Greek historian Herodotus, and modern archaeological studies. Considering the scale and precision, it required a well-organized workforce, careful planning, and continuous labor. It's believed that thousands of skilled workers, including architects, engineers, laborers, and support staff, worked year-round to complete it in that period.
So, I mean, to organize that many people, thousands of people, what were they, slaves?
While it's a common belief that the pyramids were built by slaves, more recent archaeological evidence suggests that they were actually built by a workforce of well-fed, skilled laborers. These workers lived in nearby workers' villages and were likely conscripted as part of a national labor tax or corvée system. They were organized into teams with a structured hierarchy and took pride in their work. The idea of slave labor mainly comes from later historical interpretations, but evidence points to a more organized and motivated workforce.
And all of this pyramid, at least the ones in Egypt, was built as tombs?
Yes, the pyramids in Egypt, especially the ones from the Old Kingdom like those at Giza, were built primarily as tombs for pharaohs. They were monumental burial structures designed to house the pharaoh's body and possessions for the afterlife. The shape and scale of the pyramids were also meant to demonstrate the pharaoh's divine status and ensure their safe journey to the afterlife. Inside, they contained burial chambers, sarcophagi, and various items the pharaoh might need in the afterlife, as well as passages and texts to guide their soul.
Any of this biblical?
The Bible doesn't specifically mention the pyramids or their construction. The pyramids were built long before the events described in the Bible. However, ancient Egypt and its monuments are part of the historical backdrop of the biblical narrative, particularly in the stories of the Israelites in Egypt. The Bible does reference the Hebrews being enslaved in Egypt and their eventual exodus, but it doesn't tie them directly to the construction of the pyramids. The pyramids were already ancient by the time many of the biblical events took place.
When you say many of the biblical, are we talking Abraham, Isaac, or Adam, Eve? What are we talking about?
The pyramids were already ancient by the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The Great Pyramid of Giza, for example, was built around 2580 BCE, which is centuries before the traditional timeline for Abraham, who is thought to have lived around 2000 BCE. Adam and Eve, as figures from the earliest chapters of the Bible, are placed in a time frame that isn't historically pinpointed. In any case, the pyramids predate the patriarchs of the Bible by many centuries.
But it doesn't predate Adam or Eve, or we don't know?
We don't have historical dates for Adam and Eve, since they are considered part of the biblical creation narrative rather than historical figures with a defined timeline. The biblical account of Adam and Eve doesn't provide specific dates and is often interpreted in various ways by different traditions. The pyramids, on the other hand, have well-established archaeological dates, placing their construction thousands of years before the traditional timeline of biblical patriarchs.
But we know Adam and Eve based off of Noah and the genealogy in Exodus, right?
Yes, the genealogies in the Bible, particularly in the book of Genesis, trace the lineage from Adam through figures like Noah and beyond. These genealogies provide a framework for understanding the biblical timeline, but they don't align directly with established archaeological chronologies. The genealogies are often used to estimate timelines within biblical tradition, but they don't provide precise historical dating that matches modern archaeological evidence.
So are we saying that BC AD, I thought that was the death of Christ?
Yes, the BC AD dating system is centered around the traditionally estimated birth of Christ. BC stands for before Christ, and AD stands for Anno Domini, which is Latin for in the year of our Lord. The year 1 AD was intended to mark the birth of Jesus, though modern scholars believe the actual birth was a few years earlier. When we talk about events like the construction of the pyramids, which happened around 2580 BCE, that means roughly 2,580 years before the starting point of the AD era. The genealogies in the Bible are used to estimate timelines within the biblical narrative, but they don't always align neatly with historical or archaeological dating.
So the Bible could be incorrect, or it just, because it doesn't mention that, we don't know?
It's more about the different purposes and methods of the texts. The Bible's genealogies and timelines are often used to convey theological and moral lessons, and they come from a tradition of oral history and religious storytelling. They aren't always meant to serve as precise historical records in the modern sense. On the other hand, archaeological dating is based on physical evidence and scientific methods, which can sometimes differ from traditional biblical chronologies. This doesn't mean the Bible is incorrect. It just serves a different role and perspective compared to historical and scientific analysis.
But I'm still confused. I mean, if we're saying the pyramids was built, 2500 BC, then we know Noah and or at least Abraham's timeline, don't we?
Yes, the traditional timeline for Abraham places him around 2000 BCE, which is several centuries after the construction of the Great Pyramid. Noah's story is traditionally placed even earlier than Abraham, but the exact dating is not as clearly defined. These timelines are derived from biblical genealogies and traditional interpretations, which can differ from the archaeological timelines for structures like the pyramids. Essentially, while we have historical and archaeological evidence dating the pyramids to around 2580 BCE, the biblical genealogies provide a separate framework for understanding the timeline of biblical figures like Noah and Abraham.
But it all comes down to how later, when it says that God created man in his own image, we don't know, was that how, when God created the earth, what timeline is that compared to Christ?
The creation account in the Bible, where it says God created man in his own image, is part of the Genesis narrative. This narrative doesn't provide a specific historical date and is often viewed in theological or symbolic terms rather than as a historical timeline. The timeline of creation, according to Genesis, isn't directly aligned with historical dating methods or archaeological records. In terms of the BC AD timeline, the creation story is considered to be at the very beginning, long before any recorded historical events. The timeline from the creation account to the birth of Christ is not specified in exact years within the Bible, and interpretations vary among different religious traditions. In short, the creation timeline in Genesis isn't meant to be mapped directly onto historical timelines like the construction of the pyramids or the birth of Christ. They serve different purposes and contexts.
Right, but in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John's account, that was actual historic, right?
Yes, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are considered historical accounts of the life, teachings, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. They were written as testimonies by those who witnessed or recorded the events of Jesus' life and were meant to document real historical occurrences. The events described in the Gospels, such as the birth, ministry, crucifixion, and resurrection of Jesus, are placed in a historical context and are corroborated by other historical sources from that time period. So, while the creation narrative in Genesis is more theological and symbolic, the Gospels aim to provide a historical account of Jesus' life and times, making them a key part of the historical record for early Christianity.
So historical, does that mean that as far as Christ's birth and death, we know that for sure when that happened?
We have a reasonably good idea of the time frame of Jesus' birth and death, but not exact dates. Most scholars estimate that Jesus was born around 4 to 6 BCE, based on historical references such as the reign of King Herod. His death is generally placed around 30 to 33 AD, based on historical records of the governance of Pontius Pilate and other historical markers. While the exact dates aren't pinpointed to the day, the general historical timeframe of Jesus' life is well established and supported by multiple sources, including the Gospels and Roman historical records.
So this is the year 2025. That's pretty accurate to Christ's death?
Yes, the year 2025 is based on the Gregorian calendar, which traditionally sets the birth of Jesus Christ around the year 1 AD. The calculation of the exact year of Christ's birth and death isn't perfectly precise, and many scholars believe Jesus was actually born a few years earlier than 1 AD. However, the year 2025 is still considered approximately 2025 years after the traditionally recognized birth of Christ, and the dating system remains a widely accepted reference point globally.
Okay, so we know how old, if Adam was day 0, and we know how old Noah was, right?
Yes, according to the genealogies in the Bible, we have ages and lifespans for figures like Adam, Noah, and others. For example, the Bible states that Adam lived 930 years. It also records that Noah was 600 years old at the time of the flood and lived to be 950 years old. These genealogies are used by some to create a rough timeline from Adam to later figures like Noah and Abraham. However, these ages and timelines are understood differently across various interpretations and traditions, ranging from literal to symbolic or theological understandings. So, while the Bible gives a lineage and ages, how these fit into historical or scientific chronologies is often a matter of interpretation.
But as Christians, we would take this literal, right? The Bible?
Many Christians do take the Bible literally, especially when it comes to core doctrines and teachings. However, interpretations of the early chapters of Genesis, including the creation account and genealogies, can vary among different Christian denominations and individuals. Some Christians interpret these passages literally and believe in a young earth and a historical Adam and Eve. Others see these passages as having theological or allegorical significance, understanding them in the context of ancient literature and symbolism. Overall, Christian views on how to interpret these early chapters of the Bible can range from literal to more metaphorical, but the central tenets of faith, like the life and resurrection of Jesus, remain universally important.
So do we know from Adam to Jesus how many generations that was?
Yes, the Gospel of Matthew provides a genealogy tracing the lineage from Abraham to Jesus, and the Gospel of Luke provides a genealogy that goes back from Jesus to Adam. According to Luke's genealogy, there are 77 generations from Adam to Jesus. This genealogy is often used to show the continuity from the creation of humanity to the coming of Jesus as the Messiah. Of course, the number of generations and the exact dating can vary based on different textual traditions and interpretations, but the genealogies in the Bible serve to connect these key figures across biblical history.
So, do we know, when did it stop being 900 years living? When did it start being 100 years?
According to the biblical narrative, the lifespans of humans gradually decreased after the time of the early patriarchs. For instance, Noah lived 950 years, but by the time of Abraham, lifespans had shortened significantly. Abraham lived to 175 years, and Moses lived to 120 years. By the time of the Psalms, a typical human lifespan is described as around 70 to 80 years. The years of our life are 70, or even by reason of strength 80, Psalm 90:10. This shift is reflected in the biblical text and aligns more closely with the lifespans we see historically and in the present day.
So that was around King David's time?
Yes, that's correct. By the time of King David, which is traditionally dated to around 1000 BCE, the human lifespan had already settled closer to what we consider normal today. The psalm attributed to Moses, which mentions a lifespan of 70 to 80 years, reflects the reality of lifespans around that period and beyond. This change is part of the broader narrative in the Bible, showing a gradual transition from the extremely long lifespans of the early patriarchs to more typical human lifespans.
So do we know how many years that 77 generations was?
The exact number of years covered by the 77 generations from Adam to Jesus varies depending on how one interprets the genealogies. If taken literally and linearly, some attempt to estimate the years by adding up the ages at which each patriarch had their son. However, the biblical genealogies often serve theological or symbolic purposes rather than providing a precise chronological record. Rough estimates place the time from Adam to Jesus at several thousand years. Traditional chronologies like the Usher chronology estimate about 4,000 years from Adam to Jesus. Other interpretations and scholarly estimates vary widely, especially when considering the symbolic nature of some of these genealogies. Ultimately, the exact number of years isn't definitively established and can differ based on interpretation.
So having thousands of people create the pyramid, I guess, would be possible from the time it was constructed from the time Adam was born to the time it was constructed?
Yes, if we consider the biblical genealogies and timelines, there would have been ample time for human civilization to develop and grow to the point where constructing something as monumental as the pyramids was possible. From a historical perspective, human civilization had thousands of years to advance from early agricultural societies to the complex, organized state needed to build the pyramids in ancient Egypt. The timeline from Adam to the construction of the pyramids, whether viewed through a biblical or historical lens, allows for the growth of large populations and the accumulation of the knowledge and resources necessary for such monumental projects.
Okay, Eve, thank you for your insight.
You're welcome, Chris. Anytime.